In the spring of 1945, as the Third Reich crumbled into rubble and ash, Hermann Göring found himself trapped in a traffic jam on a road leading south from Berlin. The man who had once commanded the skies over Europe, who had amassed a personal fortune in looted art worth hundreds of millions, who had been designated Adolf Hitler's successor, was now just another refugee fleeing the advancing Allied armies. When American First Lieutenant Jerome N. Shapiro discovered him stuck in that column of vehicles, Göring seemed almost relieved, as though capture by the Americans represented escape from a nightmare rather than the end of freedom. Yet just 15 years earlier, this same man had stood at the pinnacle of German society, a decorated war hero, a charismatic politician, and the architect of the Luftwaffe that had terrorized Europe. How did Hermann Göring travel the distance from fighter ace to convicted war criminal? To understand this descent, we must return to the final years of the 19th century, to a Germany that was still finding its identity as a unified nation. On January 12, 1893, Hermann Wilhelm Göring entered the world at the Marienbad Sanatorium in the Bavarian town of Rosenheim. His arrival came at a moment when Germany stood at the height of its imperial confidence. The German Empire, forged through Prussian military might and Bismarck's diplomatic genius barely 2 decades earlier, had transformed from a collection of squabbling principalities into Europe's most formidable power. Göring's father, Heinrich Ernst Göring, embodied the imperial civil service at its most accomplished. Born in 1838, Heinrich had already led a full life before Hermann's birth. He had served as a cavalry officer in the Bavarian army, distinguishing himself sufficiently to attract the attention of Otto von Bismarck himself. The Iron Chancellor dispatched Heinrich to London to study British methods of colonial administration, an assignment that spoke volumes about Heinrich's capabilities and connections. Following his studies of British imperialism, Heinrich received an even more prestigious posting, Minister Resident for German Southwest Africa, overseeing German colonial interests in what is now Namibia. This position placed Heinrich Göring at the cutting edge of Germany's imperial ambitions, administering territories seized during Europe's scramble for Africa. Though his tenure proved relatively brief, the position demonstrated Heinrich's standing within the imperial hierarchy. After his African service, Heinrich secured appointment as ambassador to Haiti, a posting that, while less glamorous than African administration, maintained his status as a significant figure in German diplomatic circles. It was during these years of diplomatic service that Heinrich's personal life took a complicated turn. Heinrich had been married before, fathering 5 children with his first wife. After her death, I remarried at age 45 in London. His new bride was Franziska Tiefenbrunn, a woman considerably younger than her husband. Franziska would give birth to 4 children with Heinrich, Karl, Olga, Paula, and finally, Hermann. Hermann's earliest years were marked by a peculiar absence. When Franziska gave birth to him in early 1893, she was still living in Germany, while Heinrich remained in Haiti fulfilling his ambassadorial duties. Rather than keeping the infant with her, Franziska made an unusual decision. She entrusted Hermann to the care of a family friend in the Bavarian countryside and returned to Haiti, leaving her newborn son behind. For the next 3 years, young Hermann lived with the Gauff family, experiencing what he would later describe as abandonment by his mother during his most formative period. This separation left deep psychological scars. When mother and son finally reunited in 1896, Hermann now 3 years old, the boy's reaction revealed the depth of his hurt. According to family accounts, when Franziska attempted to embrace her son, Hermann ran at her and tried to strike her, his small fists expressing the rage he could not articulate in words. The family subsequently relocated to Berlin, settling in the Friedenau suburb on Friedrich-Wilhelm-Straße. Here, Heinrich hoped to re-establish himself in German society after years abroad. Young Hermann, meanwhile, began absorbing the militaristic culture that permeated Imperial Germany. Even as a small child, he expressed a desire to become an officer in the German military, an ambition his father, with his own military background, actively encouraged. The family dynamics shifted dramatically during Hermann's childhood, when Dr. Hermann von Eppenstein entered their lives. Eppenstein was Hermann's godfather. Indeed, the boy had been named after him, and a figure of considerable wealth and influence. Born to a Jewish family but baptized as a Christian in childhood, Eppenstein had made a fortune through various business ventures and maintained extensive connections throughout German high society. Upon returning to Germany, Eppenstein purchased two impressive properties, Castle Mautendorf in Austria, not far from the Bavarian border, and a second castle called Weldenstein near Nuremberg. These acquisitions allowed Eppenstein to establish himself as a nobleman of sorts, and he generously extended his hospitality to the Göring family, a generosity that came with complications. Eppenstein's relationship with the Görings soon evolved beyond mere friendship. He became Franziska's lover, a development that humiliated Heinrich, but which the aging diplomat seemed powerless to prevent. The arrangement that developed was both brazen and deeply dysfunctional. When Eppenstein visited, he occupied the finest bedroom in whichever residence they shared, with Franziska's room conveniently nearby. Heinrich, meanwhile, was relegated to ground-floor accommodations and expressly forbidden from entering the upper portions of the castle where his wife and her lover resided. This bizarre domestic situation meant that Eppenstein, rather than Heinrich, effectively raised Hermann and his siblings. Heinrich played almost no role in his youngest son's upbringing, a ghost in his own household, clinging to memories of past diplomatic glory, while his wife openly conducted an affair under his roof. For young Hermann, this arrangement created a strange understanding of power and masculinity. His biological father represented impotence and humiliation, a man whose past achievements meant nothing in the face of present weakness. Eppenstein, by contrast, embodied actual power, wealth, properties, social connections, and the ability to claim whatever he wanted, including another man's wife. Yet Hermann also harbored deep resentment toward this arrangement. Later in life, he would express bitterness about the relationship between Eppenstein and his mother, even as he continued to benefit from Eppenstein's patronage and wealth. This psychological complexity, admiring power while resenting its exercise, benefiting from corruption while despising it, would characterize much of Göring's later life. Heinrich, whatever his domestic failures, remained determined that his sons would receive proper education befitting their social class. Hermann's early schooling proved unremarkable. He left his first school in Fürth in 1900, demonstrating neither particular aptitude nor interest in academic subjects. In 1904, Heinrich sent the 11-year-old Hermann to boarding school in Ansbach. Hermann hated the Ansbach school with passionate intensity. He chafed against the restrictions and regulations, despising the authority exercised over him by teachers he did not respect. In an act of spectacular defiance, Hermann spent his last remaining money on a train ticket home and, before departing, methodically cut the strings of every musical instrument in the school. The gesture perfectly captured his character. Impulsive, destructive, and utterly convinced of his right to rebel against authority he deemed illegitimate. His parents insisted he return to Ansbach, but Hermann stubbornly refused. He could not tolerate the school's constraints and believed his defiance represented not childish rebellion, but a form of natural heroism. Heinrich, drawing on his memories of military glory, had instilled in Hermann a sense that historical greatness ran in their blood, a notion the boy embraced enthusiastically, interpreting it as license for his own willfulness. Finally, in 1905, Heinrich and Eppenstein reached an agreement to send Hermann to the cadet school at Karlsruhe in Baden. The choice proved inspired. Unlike the civilian boarding school at Ansbach, the military academy provided the structure and purpose that Hermann craved. Here, he found an environment that channeled his aggressive impulses productively, offering clear hierarchies, martial values, and training for the military career he had always desired. Hermann thrived at Karlsruhe. The daily regime of military discipline, far from feeling oppressive, gave him a sense of belonging and direction. He particularly enjoyed his solitary nights, time he could spend dreaming of future glory. In 1909, he transferred to the military training college at Lichterfelde near Berlin, an even more prestigious institution that groomed Germany's future officer corps. Hermann left Lichterfelde with the highest distinctions the academy could bestow, a testament to his complete commitment to military values and his genuine aptitude for martial life. In March 1912, just 2 months after his 19th birthday, he received his commission and joined the Prince Wilhelm Regiment, specifically the 112th Infantry Regiment stationed at Mulhouse. By 1913, Göring had become a commissioned officer in the Imperial German Army, fulfilling the ambition he had harbored since childhood. He settled into life at Mulhouse and formed a close friendship with Lieutenant Bruno Loerser, a fellow officer who shared his adventurous spirit. Mulhouse was a border garrison town in German Alsace, less than a mile from the French frontier, a location that would prove highly significant within a year. Meanwhile, the delicate system of alliances and rivalries that structured European politics was approaching catastrophic failure. On June 28, 1914, in Sarajevo, a Serbian nationalist named Gavrilo Princip assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. This murder in a Balkan backwater triggered a diplomatic crisis that spiraled beyond anyone's control. Austria-Hungary, backed by Germany, issued an ultimatum to Serbia. Russia, self-appointed protector of Slavic peoples, mobilized in Serbia's defense. Germany, bound by treaty to Austria-Hungary and terrified of encirclement, declared war on Russia and France. When German forces violated Belgian neutrality to attack France, Britain entered the conflict. Within weeks, Europe had plunged into a general war that would ultimately consume millions of lives. For Lieutenant Göring and his regiment at Mulhouse, the declaration of war transformed their routine garrison duty into immediate operational relevance. When war was declared, Göring's regiment received orders to retreat behind the Rhine to establish better defensive positions. The French quickly occupied Mulhouse, positioning themselves on what had been German territory. Göring's first combat mission came shortly after these initial movements. His superiors ordered him to provide a scouting report on French positions in Mulhouse. Göring approached the assignment with characteristic boldness, perhaps recklessness. In the heat of the moment, rather than merely observing and reporting, Göring engaged the French forces directly, pushing them out of the town in a brief but intense skirmish. He returned to German lines with 4 captured French dragoon horses as war prizes, tangible evidence of his aggressive initiative. This episode established a pattern that would define Göring's entire military career. He was fearless, sometimes to the point of foolhardiness, always eager to exceed his orders, always seeking glory and recognition. The following day, Göring and his platoon entered Mulhouse on bicycles, a charmingly antiquated image of warfare that would soon be rendered obsolete by mechanized combat. They engaged French troops in another skirmish, sending the enemy into panicked retreat. Emboldened, Göring concocted an audacious plan to capture General Paul Pau, a senior French commander. The scheme failed when a nervous rifleman accidentally discharged his weapon, alerting the French to the German presence. Göring's platoon had to withdraw hastily, leaving him frustrated at missing an opportunity for the kind of spectacular achievement that could have made him instantly famous throughout Germany. Despite these early adventures, Göring's infantry service proved brief. In 1914, he was struck down by rheumatic fever and sent to a hospital in Freiburg to recover. During his convalescence, he maintained correspondence with Loerser, who had transferred to air training school. The stories Lohse shared about aviation captivated Göring's imagination. Aircraft was still a radical novelty in 1914. The Wright brothers had achieved the first powered flight barely a decade earlier, in December 1903. Military applications of aviation remained experimental and controversial. Yet Göring immediately recognized that air warfare represented the future and determined to become a pilot. He applied for transfer to flight training school and was denied. The rejection meant nothing to Göring, who had learned at Ansbach that defying authority sometimes produced better results than obedience. He simply arranged his own transfer to aviation training, bypassing official channels entirely. When superiors discovered his unauthorized transfer, he faced court-martial for insubordination. The punishment never materialized. Göring was attached to the 25th Field Air Detachment of Crown Prince Friedrich Wilhelm's Fifth Army, and his skills as an aviator soon proved too valuable to waste on disciplinary proceeding. The unauthorized transfer that should have ended his military career instead launched him toward glory. Göring and Lohse, now reunited as pilot and observer, flew reconnaissance missions together, dangerous work that required photographing and mapping enemy positions, particularly the entrenchments and artillery placements around fortified positions. The two became legends within their unit for their daring exploits. In one particularly bold mission, they flew low over enemy positions while Göring drew detailed maps of the chain of forts surrounding Verdun, intelligence of immense strategic value. During the same flight, Lohse leaned out of the aircraft and shot at enemy soldiers with his pistol when they flew low enough for effective small arms fire. Their bravery earned both men the Iron Cross First Class, Germany's highest decoration for junior officers, an extraordinary achievement for aviators in the war's early phase, when aerial combat was still finding its form. Reconnaissance dominated Göring's activities through much of 1915. Lohse, who had learned Morse code, became able to send messages to ground forces while airborne. According to one account, the first message Lohse transmitted from the air was characteristically irreverent. "You can stop firing. You won't hit the bloody target anyhow." As French air forces began organizing offensive operations, Göring and Lohse responded with increasing aggression. When French aircraft raided Crown Prince Friedrich Wilhelm's headquarters during a visit by Crown Princess Cecilia, the two aviators retaliated by badly damaging a French plane using Lohse's pistol, then dropping a small bomb on a French aerodrome. These experiences convinced Göring that aircraft needed more effective armament than pistols and hand-dropped bombs. He began carrying an improvised machine gun on reconnaissance flights, effectively becoming one of the first German airmen to bring automatic weapons into aerial combat, a development that would transform air warfare. By late 1915, aviation technology had improved sufficiently that Göring decided he wanted to pilot his own aircraft rather than serving as an observer while someone else flew. The distinction mattered enormously to him. Piloting represented greater control, greater independence, and greater potential for individual glory. Göring and Lohse both attended senior military meetings, despite their relatively junior ranks. Their extensive combat experience made their tactical insights valuable, elevating them beyond their formal positions in the military hierarchy. During one of these meetings, Göring caught the attention of Crown Prince Friedrich Wilhelm himself, a connection that would prove useful as his career progressed. Göring returned to Freiburg to complete flight training, focusing now on becoming a pursuit fighter pilot rather than a reconnaissance flyer. He never crashed during training, a remarkable achievement given the primitive state of aviation technology and the high accident rates among student pilots. In October 1915, he earned the title of Jagdflieger, pursuit fighter, qualifying him to fly the single-seat combat aircraft that were revolutionizing warfare. In November 1915, Göring and Lohse joined Jagdstaffel 5, one of the newest fighter squadrons, being formed to contest control of the skies over the Western Front. It was here that Göring would begin, accumulating the victories that would eventually make him one of Germany's most celebrated aces. His first significant aerial engagement came in November, when he encountered a Handley Page bomber, a large British aircraft with a two-man crew. The Handley Page was considerably less maneuverable than Göring's fighter, allowing him to exploit his aircraft's superior agility. He managed to maneuver into position and take the gunner out of action, but victory nearly became disaster. A squadron of Sopwith fighters, British single-seat pursuit planes, attacked Göring's aircraft. Enemy fire struck his engine and fuel tank. Göring himself sustained injuries and began losing consciousness as his damaged aircraft spiraled downward. The sound of machine gun fire somehow penetrated his fading awareness, snapping him back to alertness long enough to pull his aircraft out of the dive. He crash-landed in the cemetery of a church adjacent to a field hospital. Rescue crews pulled him from the wreckage and rushed him into emergency surgery for a critical hip wound. The doctors concluded that without immediate intervention, Göring would have bled to death within minutes. When they examined his aircraft, they counted 60 bullet holes in the fuselage, a testament to how close he had come to being killed in the air rather than merely wounded. Göring's injuries put him out of action for over a year, a lengthy period during which the nature of air warfare underwent rapid and dramatic evolution. When he had first begun flying in 1914 and 1915, aerial combat remained primitive and ad hoc. By the time he returned to duty, aviation had developed into a sophisticated military discipline with established tactics, specialized aircraft designs, and an emerging culture that would shape military aviation for generations. The art of aerial combat was becoming heavily romanticized, even as it was being developed. Fighter pilots were portrayed as modern knights engaged in individual combat, a stark contrast to the anonymous mass slaughter occurring in the trenches below. This mythology appealed enormously to men like Göring, who craved recognition and glory. In the air, individual skill, courage, and quick thinking could determine outcomes in ways that were increasingly impossible in ground warfare's mechanized killing fields. During his convalescence, Göring undoubtedly followed news of aerial combat developments. The period saw the emergence of true fighter aces, pilots who accumulated impressive tallies of enemy aircraft destroyed. Names like Oswald Boelke, Max Immelmann, and Manfred von Richthofen, the legendary Red Baron, became household names in Germany. Their exploits celebrated in newspapers and inspiring a generation of young men to seek glory in the skies. By mid-1916, Göring had recovered sufficiently to return to duty. He rejoined Luftwaffe in January 1917, now assigned to Field Squadron 26 based at Mulhouse, the same town where Göring had seen his first ground combat nearly 3 years earlier. The war had changed dramatically since those early days. What many had expected to be a short, decisive conflict had metastasized into a grinding war of attrition that was bleeding all combatant nations white. Göring's reputation as a fighter pilot had grown during his absence, and he received several prestigious decorations recognizing his earlier combat achievements. In rapid succession, he was awarded the Zähringer Lion with Swords, the Karl Friedrich Order, and the Hohenzollern Medal with Swords Third Class, honors that marked him as one of Germany's distinguished military aviators. In May 1917, Göring received command of his own squadron, the 27th Fighter Squadron, which operated from the same airfield as Luftwaffe's 26th Squadron near Flanders. This appointment represented a significant career milestone. At just 24 years old, Göring now commanded his own unit, responsible not merely for his own survival and success, but for the lives and effectiveness of the pilots under his command. The two squadrons, Göring's 27th and Luftwaffe's 26th, often coordinated operations, effectively functioning as a larger combined unit. This arrangement worked well given the personal friendship and mutual trust between the two commanders. In 1918, as Germany launched its final desperate offensive on the Western Front, Göring and Loese's squadrons were incorporated into a larger formation, Jagdgeschwader 1, commanded by the legendary Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron himself. Von Richthofen had become Germany's most celebrated ace, credited with 80 confirmed aerial victories. His unit, nicknamed the Flying Circus due to the brightly colored aircraft his pilots flew, represented the elite of German aviation. Being selected to join Jagdgeschwader 1 represented the pinnacle of achievement for a German fighter pilot. Göring now found himself flying alongside the most skilled and celebrated aviators Germany possessed, engaged in the kind of aerial combat that was being romanticized even as it occurred. Yet the glory of aerial combat could not compensate for Germany's deteriorating strategic position. By early 1918, it was becoming clear to perceptive observers that Germany was losing the war. The entry of the United States into the conflict in 1917 had fundamentally altered the balance of forces. American industrial might and fresh troops were flowing into France, while Germany's resources and manpower were approaching exhaustion. Göring witnessed firsthand the desperation of Germany's spring 1918 offensive, a last-ditch attempt to achieve victory before American forces arrived in overwhelming numbers. The offensive initially achieved dramatic breakthroughs but ultimately failed to deliver the decisive victory Germany needed. Then, on April 21, 1918, catastrophe struck Jagdgeschwader and Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron, Germany's greatest ace, the symbol of German aviation prowess, was killed in action. The exact circumstances of his death remain disputed. Both Australian groundfire and Canadian pilot Arthur Roy Brown have been credited with the fatal shots. What was indisputable was the psychological impact. Germany's greatest fighter pilot was dead. The death of Manfred von Richthofen sent shockwaves through German military aviation and the broader public. The Red Baron had been more than just a skilled pilot. He had become a symbol of German military prowess, a figure whose exploits offered hope and pride to a population increasingly desperate for good news from the fronts. In the immediate aftermath of Richthofen's death, Captain Wilhelm Reinhard assumed command of Jagdgeschwader 1. Reinhard was an experienced and capable officer, but his tenure proved tragically brief. Just weeks after taking command, he was killed while test flying an experimental aircraft, ironically, the same type of plane that Göring had recently flown himself without incident. On July 7, 1918, the question of who would command Germany's most prestigious fighter squadron was finally settled. Hermann Göring, at just 25 years of age, was selected to lead Jagdgeschwader 1. In a solemn ceremony, he received the Richthofen emblem, a walking stick that had been passed down by each successive commander of the unit. This carved stick represented continuity with Richthofen's legacy and symbolized the burden of command that Göring now assumed. Göring would treasure this walking stick for the remainder of his life, keeping it with him through all the tumultuous decades that followed, through revolution, political struggle, imprisonment, and eventually his trial at Nuremberg. It represented perhaps the pinnacle of his achievements, command of Germany's elite fighter squadron during the Great War, following in the footsteps of the legendary Red Baron himself. Yet even as Göring accepted this honor, the strategic situation was deteriorating rapidly. The German spring offensive had failed to achieve its objectives. American troops were arriving in France in ever-increasing numbers. The Allied blockade was starving Germany's civilian population, and on the battlefield itself, new technologies, particularly tanks, were beginning to break the stalemate of trench warfare in favor of the Allies. As autumn 1918 arrived, the orders Göring and his squadron received became increasingly contradictory and confused, symptomatic of a military command structure that was beginning to fracture under the weight of impending defeat. On November 10, 1918, Göring received instructions directing him to surrender his squadron's aircraft to American forces. Yet another order, issued almost simultaneously, commanded him to evacuate all equipment to Darmstadt in central Germany. Then, on November 11th, came the official news. An armistice had been signed. The war was over. Germany had lost. Along with the armistice announcement came yet another order: halt all evacuations. The contradictory nature of these commands, surrender the planes, evacuate the equipment, stop evacuating, reflected the chaos consuming Germany's military and political leadership. Göring refused to comply with the order to surrender. He had spent 4 years fighting for Germany, had been wounded multiple times, had commanded the Red Baron's own squadron. The thought of meekly handing over his aircraft to the enemy was intolerable. Instead, he ordered his pilots to fly to Darmstadt, defying the explicit command to surrender to the Americans at Strasbourg. Some of his pilots, whether through miscommunication or individual choice, ignored Göring's instructions and flew to Strasbourg as originally ordered, surrendering to the French. Others mistakenly flew to Mannheim, where revolutionary soldiers and workers' councils had seized power. These revolutionary committees confiscated the pilots' firearms, an act that enraged Göring when word reached him. Without hesitation, Göring flew to Mannheim with the remainder of his squadron. He confronted the Revolutionary Council and threatened to have his squadron bomb the aerodrome if the weapons were not immediately returned. Faced with this threat of aerial bombardment, the revolutionaries capitulated and released the confiscated arms. Finally arriving at Darmstadt, Göring issued his final order as commander of Jagdgeschwader 1, crash land all aircraft to render them unusable. He would not allow the planes under his command to fall into enemy hands. His pilots complied, deliberately damaging their aircraft upon landing to make them worthless as war prizes. On this note of defiance and destruction, Hermann Göring was honorably discharged from the German Air Force with the rank of captain in the Bavarian town of Aschaffenburg. It was here that Göring discovered an unexpected talent. He was a gifted orator. His men gathered to hear him speak, and Göring delivered passionate addresses in which he raged against the German people's supposed betrayal of an army that had sacrificed everything to defend the nation. This theme, the stab-in-the-back legend, claiming that Germany's military had been betrayed by civilian politicians and leftist agitators rather than defeated on the battlefield, would become a cornerstone of right-wing German politics in the years ahead. Göring had found his voice for articulating this narrative, and his men cheered him enthusiastically as he denounced the revolution that had toppled the Kaiser and established the new German Republic. The immediate post-war years found Göring living a nomadic existence. The skills that had made him a celebrated fighter ace, quick reflexes, aggression, tactical boldness, had little application in civilian life. Unlike some former officers who possessed university education or family businesses to return to, Göring had no obvious path forward. He had been a soldier since age 17. Warfare was the only profession he knew. He spent some time in Denmark in 1920, drifting without clear purpose or direction. It was during this period that Count Erik von Rosen, a renowned Swedish explorer, asked Göring to fly him to his estate on Lake Boven in Sweden. The weather turned dangerously bad during the flight, and by the time they landed on the frozen lake, it was too late for Göring to depart safely. Count von Rosen invited him to stay the night at his castle. This chance encounter would prove life-changing. At dinner that evening, Göring met Baroness Karin von Kantzow, the sister of Count von Rosen's wife. Göring fell in love with her immediately, or so he would later claim. Karin was 5 years older than Hermann, married with an 8-year-old son, but estranged from her Swedish husband. She was drawn to Göring's intensity and his war hero status. while Göring found in her the aristocratic refinement and emotional warmth he craved. By the end of Göring's stay, he and Karin had arranged to meet again at her parents' home in Sweden. The romance developed quickly, despite the obvious obstacles. Karin's father was Baron Karl Fock, an officer in the Swedish army, while her mother was Baroness Huldine Beamish Fock, an Englishwoman whose family had lived in Ireland. Karin's sister Fanny had been married to Count Richard von Wilamowitz-Müllendorf, a German officer killed in the war, a loss that had created sympathy toward Germany within the family and perhaps made them more receptive to Göring's courtship of Karin. Nevertheless, the prospect of divorce and Göring's unemployed status made the match problematic from the family's perspective. Göring returned to Berlin in 1921 to enroll at university, studying political science at age 28, an unusual student, older than most of his peers, supported by Karin with money her husband agreed to provide as part of their divorce settlement. Göring married Karin on February 3, 1922, in Munich, and the couple moved to Hochkreuz in the Bavarian Alps, roughly 50 miles from the Bavarian capital. Both Hermann and Karin were ardent nationalists, and it didn't take long for them to become involved in the political ferment sweeping Bavaria. Bavaria in 1922 was a hotbed of right-wing political activity. The state government was ineffective at controlling radical political parties, and various nationalist and Völkisch movements flourished there. Chief among these was the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the NSDAP or Nazi Party, based in Munich. The core of the Nazi Party consisted of the SA, the Sturmabteilung or stormtroopers, composed largely of working-class men and war veterans who guarded party meetings and instigated fights with communist and socialist organizations. The Bavarian government actually welcomed the Nazis to some extent because they frequently attacked the Communist Party, which Bavarian authorities feared far more than right-wing nationalism. Göring met Adolf Hitler in 1922 and quickly became active in the party. Hitler, recognizing Göring's value as a decorated war hero and the commander of Richthofen's squadron, offered him a position as leader of the SA. This appointment was strategically brilliant for Hitler. The SA had been a disorganized rabble of street brawlers, but now it would be led by one of Germany's most celebrated military figures. Göring accepted the position and set out two explicit goals. First, he would transform the SA into a disciplined organization capable of carrying out orders effectively. Second, he would recruit young idealists willing to devote their free time and energy to the movement, as well as workers who could be drawn away from socialist and communist parties. Göring's war record made him ideal for this role. As he later reflected, the SA needed someone whom counter-revolutionaries and nationalists would respect, someone with legitimate credentials. Hitler himself would later praise Göring's work, contrasting it favorably with the later leadership of Ernst Röhm. He is the only one of its heads that ran the SA properly. I gave him a disheveled rabble. In a short time he had organized a division of 11,000 men. The two men formed an unlikely partnership. Göring was an aristocratic war hero from a diplomatic family, receiving orders from Hitler, a low-born Austrian who had never risen above the rank of Gefreiter, lance corporal or officer's runner, during the war. Yet both men possessed charisma and understood instinctively how to manipulate crowds and build a political movement. In 1923, the Görings moved to a modest home in the Munich suburb of Obermenzing. Despite their limited means, their house became a regular meeting place for leading Nazis. Here, Göring would encounter Rudolf Hess, a great war pilot like himself, Alfred Rosenberg, a self-proclaimed philosopher and ideologue, and Ernst Röhm, an active military officer with connections to weapons depots, connections that would prove invaluable for arming the SA. These men were precisely the sort of company Göring found comfortable. They were fellow veterans, nationalists, men of action rather than abstract theorists. Göring's relationship with Hitler during this period was similar to Röhm's in some respects. Hitler had found a way to leverage the best traits of both men while keeping their more problematic impulses in check. Röhm's active status in the Bavarian military facilitated easy recruitment into the SA, and Röhm's connections to weapons stores ensured the stormtroopers could be armed when necessary. Göring viewed Röhm more as a rival than an ally, both men jockeying for Hitler's favor and for influence within the movement. Though Röhm held the title of Chief of Staff of the SA, it was Göring who truly commanded the organization in these early years. Throughout 1923, Göring strenuously organized and drilled the SA in woods outside Munich. He maintained a complex relationship with Bavaria's state government. The SA operated in a legal grey area, tolerated because they fought communists but viewed with suspicion because of their obvious revolutionary potential. Violence erupted between communists and Nazis on May 1st, 1923, International Workers' Day, traditionally a rallying day for leftist movements. The clash forced Göring and other Nazi leaders to rethink their strategy for growth. They needed allies within Bavaria's military and political establishment if they hoped to eventually seize power. Throughout 1923, Göring and Hitler both attempted to convince General von Lossow, commander of Bavarian Reichswehr forces, to join them in overthrowing the national government in Berlin. Gustav Stresemann had become German Chancellor and enacted martial law in response to increasing political unrest, partly caused by the Black Reichswehr, secret military units associated with extremist organizations that threatened the government. The Black Reichswehr was connected to FEMA, a secretive society marked by extreme violence that surpassed even the street brutality of the SA and communist paramilitary groups. The Weimar government's policy of passive resistance to the French occupation of the Ruhr infuriated nationalists like Göring and Hitler, who saw it as yet another capitulation to Germany's enemies. Göring made one final attempt to convince General von Lossow to break with Berlin and join the Nazis in a coup. The general refused, leaving Hitler and Göring without military support for any uprising. However, an opportunity soon presented itself. Gustav von Kahr, the new state commissioner for Bavaria, announced a major meeting for November 8, 1923, at the Bürgerbräukeler Beer Hall. Kahr, along with Colonel Hans Ritter von Seisser, Bavaria's police chief, and General von Lossow, would address 3,000 attendees. Hitler believed Kahr intended to declare Bavarian independence, a move that would steal the Nazis' thunder and leave them marginalized. Hitler decided to act first, using the rally as his springboard for revolution. Göring was stressed during the planning period. His mother had just died, his wife Karin had pneumonia, and he was attempting to gather stormtroopers for what everyone understood would be an extremely dangerous operation. On the evening of November 8th, Hitler stormed the beer hall with armed SA men. He jumped onto a table, fired a shot into the air, and shouted, "The national revolution has begun." Hitler then hustled Kahr, von Seisser, and von Lossow into a back room, where, at gunpoint, he attempted to convince them to join the uprising. Meanwhile, Göring took the podium to address the confused and frightened crowd. Reading the room expertly, he shouted, "There is nothing to fear. We are your friends. You've no reason to grumble, you've got your beer." The crowd, reassured by Göring's jovial manner, relaxed somewhat and even laughed. In the back room, Hitler had brought in General Erich Ludendorff, Germany's military commander during the later stages of the Great War, and a figure of immense prestige. Ludendorff's presence was meant to lend legitimacy to the putsch. However, Ludendorff was furious at not being consulted about the plan beforehand, creating immediate tension among the conspirators. The captive officials, Kahr, von Seisser, and von Lossow, reluctantly agreed to support the new government, seemingly won over by Ludendorff's participation. But then Hitler made a critical error. Fighting had erupted in the streets between SA forces and Bavarian soldiers, and Hitler left Ludendorff in charge while he went to settle the confrontation. In Hitler's absence, Ludendorff allowed the 3 Bavarian officials to leave, accepting their word of honor that they would support the Nazi takeover. They immediately betrayed this promise. Kahr quietly moved the state government to Regensburg, printed pamphlets denouncing any allegiance to the Nazis, and ensured the Bavarian military remained loyal to the legitimate government. As morning dawned on November 9th, the putsch was already unraveling. While Hitler had been attempting to suppress street fighting, Ernst Röhm had seized the War Ministry building. Now the conspirators debated their next move. Their plan had depended on gaining the support of Bavaria's military and police forces. Without that support, they had no realistic path to victory. Ludendorff proposed that they march to the center of Munich, confident that soldiers and police would not fire on him due to his reputation and prestige. It was a gamble born of desperation, but the conspirators had few alternatives. By 11 a.m., Ludendorff led a column of approximately 3,000 Nazis toward central Munich. The marchers had to cross the Ludwig Bridge to reach the inner city, where armed police blocked their path. Göring approached the police officers alone, informing them that the Nazis held hostages and that if force were used against the marchers, the hostages and those who resisted would be shot. The police, unwilling to test whether this threat was genuine, stood down and allowed the column to advance, though they confiscated weapons as a precaution. The Nazi march continued through the Zweibrückenstrasse, heading toward the War Ministry, where Röhm was under siege. To reach it, they had to pass through Residenzstrasse, a narrow street where armed police again blocked their way. The Nazis shouted at the police to surrender. Then shots rang out. The exact sequence of events remains disputed. Who fired first, whether it was an accidental discharge or deliberate shooting. What followed was chaos. The Nazis scattered, some firing back, others seeking cover, many simply fleeing in panic. Göring was shot in the groin, bleeding heavily from the wound. Men dragged him into a nearby building, ironically, owned by a Jewish furniture dealer named Robert Ballin and his wife Ilse. The Ballins dressed Göring's wound as best they could, an act of compassion that Göring would remember years later when the Nazis implemented their genocidal policies toward Germany's Jewish population. After nightfall, Karin arrived to learn that General von Lossow had issued a warrant for Göring's arrest. Despite his serious wounds, Göring begged her to help him escape Bavaria. His condition was grave, the bullet wound had become infected, and he urgently needed proper medical treatment. Yet Göring knew that capture would mean imprisonment or worse. With help from friends in the town of Garmisch-Partenkirchen, Karin arranged to smuggle Hermann to safety. Göring's recovery proved slow and agonizing. His wounds became repeatedly reinfected, leaving him in constant pain and increasingly bitter about the failed putsch. Before long, Göring's presence in Garmisch became widely known. Mass demonstrations broke out, with local populations showing surprising sympathy for the putschists despite their failure. Under pressure from these public displays of support, authorities arrested Göring and placed him under guard at a hospital. But just days later, with Karin's persistence and tacit support from sympathetic police, Göring was smuggled out of Germany and into Austria. He underwent surgery in a hospital in Innsbruck, but the procedure offered only temporary relief. For weeks following the operation, Göring suffered from high fevers and excruciating pain. The doctors prescribed morphine twice daily to manage his agony. This medical necessity marked the beginning of Göring's morphine addiction, a dependency he would struggle with for the rest of his life, one that would eventually contribute to his physical and psychological deterioration in the years ahead. Due to his military service and Ernst Röhm's position in the military, Göring was released from serving time at his trial. Hitler, however, was arrested and tried for his role in the putsch, and while serving time, refused to let Göring stand trial, forcing him to remain in exile. His first assignment came in February 1924 when he was invited to speak at a nationalist convention in Innsbruck. Göring soon assumed a leadership role for the Nazi Party's activities in Vienna, working closely with Austrian Nazi Walter Riehl. He and Karin stayed at the Tirolerhof Hotel, barely able to pay for their lodgings. Most of their possessions had been impounded by Bavarian authorities. In March 1924, Göring stood trial in absentia alongside Hitler, Röhm, and the other putsch leaders. Ludendorff was acquitted. Hitler was found guilty and sentenced to 5 years, though he would serve less than 9 months. Göring was also found guilty in absentia. Göring filed for amnesty but was denied. The trial results should have ended the Nazi Party, but instead public sympathy for the putschists grew. The Nazis gained seats in the Reichstag, demonstrating that the failed putsch had actually increased their political support rather than destroying the movement. The Görings left Austria and travelled through Italy, stopping in Rome, where they received an audience with Benito Mussolini. The Italian dictator, who had successfully seized power through his March on Rome in 1922, listened to their account of the failed beer hall putsch. For Göring, this meeting with Il Duce represented validation, proof that fascist movements could succeed in seizing power if they learned from their mistakes. After Italy, the couple moved to Sweden, settling in a flat in Ödengatan to care for Karin's ailing mother. But Karin's own health was deteriorating. She began suffering epileptic seizures with increasing frequency. As Karin's condition worsened, so did Göring's, his morphine addiction deepening as pain and frustration mounted. In 1927, President Paul von Hindenburg issued a general political amnesty that included Göring. Eager to return to his homeland after years of exile, Göring immediately made plans to go back to Germany. He worked to reconnect with Hitler and secure employment within the Nazi movement. Göring's former position as SA leader was now occupied by Franz Pfeffer von Salomon, a wealthy aristocrat whom Hitler could not afford to dismiss due to the financial support he provided. The Nazi Party remained fiscally weak and needed wealthy backers to survive. Göring's precarious financial situation meant he couldn't offer similar support, but Hitler accepted him back into the party fold and sent him to Berlin to work on building the party's presence in the capital while also accumulating wealth. Göring's connections to the airline industry proved valuable. His friend Erhard Milch, a senior executive at Lufthansa, secured him a position as business representative with the Bavarian Motor Works company, BMW. By winter, Göring had successfully petitioned Hitler to make him one of the Nazi candidates for the upcoming Reichstag election. He proved he could stand a chance by positioning himself against Otto and Gregor Strasser, brothers who had broken away from Hitler's leadership due to ideological differences, promoting a more leftist interpretation of National Socialism that Hitler rejected, in favor of courting business interests and middle class support. Göring's position as a Reichstag representative suited the Nazi Party perfectly. He could banter effectively with society's elite, a skill Hitler lacked, as the Führer felt uncomfortable in the company of intellectuals and found small talk excruciating. In the 1928 election, the Nazis performed poorly overall, but both Joseph Goebbels and Göring secured Reichstag seats. Hitler and Goebbels were disappointed by the results, but Göring was ecstatic. The position renewed his depleted family wealth and allowed him to move into a modern 5-room apartment at 7 Baden-Schestrasse in Berlin. As a Reichstag deputy, Göring secured appointment to the Communications Committee, which also oversaw aviation. He lobbied vigorously to increase funding for the airline industry, funding that flowed exclusively to his friends at Lufthansa. Göring justified this by calling it a great patriotic task that needed fulfillment. In reality, it served dual purposes, enriching his associates and building up Germany's aviation infrastructure, which could be rapidly converted to military purposes when the time came. The The strategy of using civilian aviation funding to create military capacity was transparent to anyone paying attention. But in the late 1920s, with the Nazis still a marginal political force, few people worried about Göring's machinations. This lobbying effort also served to bribe industrialists into supporting the Nazi Party, the wealthy aviation executives who benefited from Göring's advocacy became financial backers of the movement. On September 25, 1928, Karin's mother passed away. Karin, barely well enough to travel, attended the funeral in Stockholm. Göring returned to Berlin immediately afterward, believing that throwing himself into work was the only way to cope with grief. But tragedy would strike even harder 2 years later. On October 17, 1931, Karin, who had been ill with tuberculosis for years, died of heart failure at age 43. Göring was devastated. He returned to Berlin after the funeral, convincing himself that work was the only remedy for overwhelming loss. Karin had been his emotional anchor, the aristocratic refinement to his brutal ambition. Her death left him unmoored. On January 30, 1933, Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. The Nazi seizure of power had finally succeeded, not through violent putsch, but through political maneuvering and exploitation of the Weimar Republic's constitutional weaknesses. Hermann Göring held 3 positions in Hitler's new cabinet: Minister without portfolio, Minister of the Interior for Prussia, and Reich Commissioner for Aviation. As Minister without portfolio, Göring acted as an ambassador speaking on behalf of Nazi Germany in various diplomatic contexts. The position of Minister of the Interior for Prussia was technically subordinate to former Chancellor Franz von Pappen's supervision, but it gave Göring authority over police forces in Germany's largest and most important state. As Reich Commissioner for Aviation, he had the honor of developing the air force that would become the Luftwaffe. Göring also maintained his role as President of the Reichstag until the Nazis dissolved it on March 5, 1933, following a fire at the Reichstag, building on February 28 that the Nazis blamed on communist agitators, though historians now believe the Nazis themselves staged the fire as a pretext for consolidating power, which Göring played a significant role, though his conception of these camps differed from what they would eventually become. Göring initially envisioned the camps as re-education facilities for those suffering from what he termed political delinquency, rather than as instruments of terror and mass murder. Much of the concentration camp system's early history centered around intense rivalry between Göring, Heinrich Himmler, and Ernst Röhm. Each man sought to control the apparatus of state repression, recognizing that power in the new Germany would flow from command of the police and paramilitary forces. As part of this power struggle, Göring created a secret police force to patrol Prussia. This organization would eventually become known as the Geheime Staatspolizei, the secret state police, abbreviated as Gestapo. Himmler, not to be outmaneuvered, became police chief of Bavaria and began building his own security apparatus around the SS. In an effort to keep power consolidated and prevent Himmler from gaining too much independence, Göring moved the Gestapo on April 26, 1934, from Prussian administration to its own dedicated headquarters, giving it autonomy from other government departments. This move was intended to strengthen Göring's control, but ironically, it would facilitate the Gestapo's eventual transfer to Himmler. Hitler wanted to unify Germany's various police forces under centralized control. On April 20, 1934, he transferred the Gestapo to Himmler, effectively removing it from Göring's direct authority. This transfer represented a significant setback in Göring's power struggle with Himmler, though Göring would retain considerable influence through other channels. The rivalry with Röhm was also intensifying. By early 1934, Röhm was attempting to merge the SA with the Reichswehr, creating a unified military force under his command, a move that threatened both Hitler and Göring. The SA had established nearly 50 concentration camps by the end of 1933, despite Göring's supposed monopoly on approved camps. In an act of defiance, the SS founded Dachau concentration camp in spring 1933 without authorization. When Göring's men attempted to investigate, SS guards fired upon them. Hitler eventually forced Himmler to close the camp temporarily, but Göring had been decisively outmaneuvered. He had lost control of the police apparatus to Himmler, while Röhm's SA was becoming increasingly bold in its demands. Göring and Himmler, recognizing their mutual interest in eliminating Röhm, formed an alliance. They would need time to build their case and prepare, but the target was now clear. While these political struggles consumed his days, Göring's personal life was becoming increasingly problematic. His health was failing, partly as a consequence of his chaotic lifestyle. Göring had developed irregular eating habits, gorging himself when entertaining guests, but skipping meals when preoccupied with work. His preferred foods ran towards sandwiches, beer, and especially cake. The combination of erratic eating, minimal exercise, and his ongoing morphine addiction had caused him to gain considerable weight. His sleeping habits were equally destructive. Göring habitually stayed awake until 2 or 3 in the morning, often watching films in his private screening room. He requested to be awakened at 6:30 a.m. regardless of when he had gone to bed. Yet despite chronic sleep deprivation, he suffered from severe insomnia, leaving him exhausted but unable to rest properly. In May 1933, Hitler appointed Göring Reichsmaster of the Hunt and Master of the German Forest, positions that suited Göring's self-image as an aristocratic sportsman. He enthusiastically embraced these roles, invoking strict laws to protect wildlife. Elk, bison, wild boar, swans, and birds of prey all received protection under Göring's regulations. He restricted the number of hunting permits issued and outlawed poaching, hunting on horseback, and the use of traps. It was this love of nature and forestry that led Göring to purchase prime real estate in the Schorfheide, a vast forested area near the Baltic Sea and Polish border. Here, he would construct Karin Hall, an enormous estate named after his deceased first wife. Göring designed every aspect of the house himself, he later boasted, down to the door handles. The estate would become both a wildlife sanctuary and a monument to his ego, eventually housing much of the art collection he would loot from occupied Europe. Just before Himmler wrested control of the Gestapo from him, Robert Dahls came to Göring with a new surveillance tool acquired from abroad, equipment capable of intercepting and listening to telephone conversations. Göring immediately recognized the value of this technology and turned it over to his intelligence agents, instructing his research staff officers to begin monitoring nearly all high-ranking Nazi officials. The list of surveillance targets that Göring compiled was remarkably comprehensive. He was essentially spying on his colleagues, gathering compromising information that could be weaponized in political struggles. The wiretaps captured everything, including jokes about Göring himself. Rather than reacting with anger, Göring reportedly enjoyed these jokes and laughed at them, secure, enough in his power that mockery didn't threaten him. The most important intelligence Göring gathered through wiretapping concerned the brewing conflict with Ernst Röhm, intercepted conversations between General Werner von Blomberg, Minister of Defense and head of the Reichswehr, and SA leaders Karl Ernst and Röhm himself revealed mounting tensions. Von Blomberg expressed profound anxiety about Röhm's ambitions to subsume the army under SA control. The conversations also confirmed Göring's suspicions about Röhm's personal animosity. The SA chief was heard calling Göring the pig and Herr reaction. These intercepts provided Göring and Himmler with ammunition to build their case against Röhm. They needed to convince Hitler that Röhm posed an existential threat to the regime, and that opportunity came when Röhm proposed a joint conference between the SA, SS, and Reichswehr. The growing resentment against Röhm wasn't limited to Göring and Himmler. The traditional military leadership viewed Röhm's ambitions with alarm. If Hitler wouldn't stop Röhm, the army officers made clear they could not support the Führer. The Reichswehr, Germany's professional military, would not stand idly by while a paramilitary rabble commanded by a homosexual former captain replaced them. The SA was called to Bad WWI for a leadership conference, ostensibly to discuss the organization's future. It was here that the trap would be sprung. Hitler and other top Nazi officials, including SS forces, raided the Hanselbauer Hotel on June 30, 1934, arresting Röhm and other SA leaders in compromising circumstances. While Hitler was in Bavaria conducting the arrests, Göring remained in Berlin to coordinate the broader purge. He personally raided SA headquarters in the capital, moving methodically from room to room, pointing at specific individuals and ordering their immediate arrest. The operation had been planned with meticulous detail. Göring knew exactly who should be taken into custody. The Night of the Long Knives, as it came to be known, was an act of political suppression designed to eliminate internal opposition and settle scores. The purge extended beyond the SA leadership to include other enemies of the regime. Former Chancellor Kurt von Schleicher was murdered along with his wife. Gregor Strasser, who had led a leftist faction within the Nazi Party, was hunted down and killed. Various conservative critics of the regime also fell victim. Göring's role in orchestrating the Berlin portion of the purge was essential to its success. His willingness to order mass arrests and executions without hesitation demonstrated both his ruthlessness and his value to Hitler as an enforcer. The purge eliminated Röhm, Göring's primary rival for military authority, and solidified the SS's dominance over the SA. Himmler had achieved the autonomy he sought for his organization, and Göring had removed an obstacle to his own power. The year 1935 brought significant developments in Göring's personal life. On April 10th, he asked Emmy Sonnemann, an actress he had been dating since 1932, to marry him. Emmy had remained patient through the years when Göring was still grieving Karin, and now he was finally ready to remarry. The wedding was planned as a grand state occasion with elaborate pomp and ceremony. Streets were decorated, soldiers lined the routes leading to the cathedral, and all traffic was halted for the procession. Hitler served as best man, a signal honor that demonstrated Göring's standing within the regime. Following the wedding, Emmy was effectively crowned as First Lady of the Third Reich by Hitler himself. The couple retreated to Karin Hall with a small entourage, though Göring slipped away privately to spend an hour at Karin's tomb in the estate's mausoleum, a gesture that revealed his continuing emotional connection to his first wife. The next morning, Hermann and Emmy departed for Wiesbaden, then continued to Yugoslavia for their honeymoon. On February 4th, 1938, Göring was promoted to Reichsmarschall, the highest military rank in Germany, a position specially created for him by Hitler. This promotion came after Hitler dismissed 6 generals for suspected anti-Nazi sympathies and promoted himself to commander-in-chief of the German armed forces. The shake-up allowed Hitler to consolidate military control, and Göring's elevation symbolized his position as Hitler's primary military subordinate. In March 1938, Germany annexed Austria in the Anschluss, the union that incorporated Hitler's homeland into the Greater German Reich. Following the annexation, the Austrian Nazi Party pressed Göring to increase anti-Semitic propaganda and persecution in the newly acquired territory. Göring was reluctant to fully embrace the most extreme anti-Jewish measures. He enjoyed Jewish composers and painters, though he believed Jews were guilty of profiteering and scheming that had contributed to Germany's defeat in World War I. In private conversations with Emmy, he would say with a grin, "The Jews were just like any other people, but a bit smarter," adding that they had both good and bad individuals among them. When Goebbels and Himmler discussed the extermination of Jews, Göring reportedly felt squeamish and often excused himself from such conversations. This squeamishness, however, did not prevent him from implementing anti-Jewish policies when politically expedient, as he would demonstrate in the years ahead. On June 2, 1938, Emmy gave birth to their daughter, Edda, the Göring's first and only child together. Hitler served as the newborn's godfather, cementing the ties between the two families. For Göring, fatherhood represented a kind of normalcy that contrasted starkly with his increasingly dark role in the Nazi regime. The following year, September 1, 1939, German troops invaded Poland. Göring had reached the pinnacle of his power. Hitler had formally designated him as his successor should anything happen to the Führer. Yet as war began, tensions between Göring and Hitler over strategic decisions would begin to emerge and deepen. Göring wanted to launch an immediate air assault on Britain, while Hitler preferred to focus on the conquest of France first. Hitler instead set his sights on the Nordic countries, though Göring had personally guaranteed Sweden's neutrality despite Hitler's desire to invade for access to Swedish iron ore. Göring successfully brokered a treaty ensuring Sweden would remain independent while supplying Germany with essential resources. Following the British evacuation at Dunkirk in late May 1940, Göring requested immediate authorization to attack Britain. He believed the demoralized and disorganized state of British forces presented a window for even an ill-conceived air campaign to succeed. Hitler refused, convinced that Britain would negotiate surrender within weeks. Göring knew better. Britain would only capitulate after sustaining devastating military defeats. When the Luftwaffe was finally unleashed against Britain, it met far heavier resistance than anticipated. The Germans had underestimated advances in British radar technology and the effectiveness of British code-breaking operations. In the sustained air campaign that became known as the Battle of Britain, the Luftwaffe lost approximately 1,500 aircraft, a devastating toll that marked the beginning of Göring's declining reputation. The year-long bombing campaign against England, the Blitz, failed to break British resistance or force Churchill's government to negotiate. This failure represented a turning point. The Luftwaffe, which Göring had built and commanded, had been unable to achieve the decisive victory that might have ended British involvement in the war. On August 9, 1940, Göring and Hitler engaged in a heated argument about Germany's next strategic moves. Hitler announced his intention to attack the Soviet Union as a preventative measure, despite the non-aggression pact the two nations had signed. Göring objected vehemently, pulling Hitler up on his hypocrisy in Mein Kampf. Hitler had explicitly warned against involving Germany in a two-front war, the strategic error that had doomed Germany in World War I. Now Hitler proposed doing exactly that, attacking the Soviet Union while Britain remained undefeated. Göring pleaded with Hitler to study Napoleon's catastrophic invasion of Russia in 1812 as a cautionary tale. Hitler, however, had become obsessed with attacking the Soviet Union. Göring argued passionately that the Russians, like the British, would not negotiate peace terms simply because Germany wanted them to. Hitler dismissed these objections, and preparations for Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, proceeded. The invasion commenced on June 22, 1941, initially achieving spectacular successes. German forces advanced rapidly across Soviet territory, capturing hundreds of thousands of prisoners and destroying vast quantities of Soviet equipment. But Göring's warnings would prove prophetic. The operation would eventually bog down in the Russian winter, leading to catastrophic losses and the beginning of Germany's ultimate defeat. In 1941, Göring became deeply involved with what would become one of his most infamous activities, the systematic looting of European art. He had long planned to open the Hermann Göring Museum, an art gallery scheduled to debut in 1953. He loved Renaissance and Dutch paintings, subjects on which he was genuinely knowledgeable after years of study. Göring maintained 4 stately homes that needed to be filled with appropriate artwork. He would spend hours staring at paintings, lost in aesthetic contemplation that seemed entirely divorced from his brutal political activities. He employed multiple staff members to help acquire art, instructing them not to worry about the racial background of sellers. Only the quality of the artwork mattered. When further anti-Jewish laws were enacted, Göring cynically used his power to assist Jewish art dealers in escaping to Switzerland, not out of humanitarian concern, but to facilitate ongoing art transactions. He worked closely with directors of national museums, including the Louvre, to build special bunkers protecting art from bombing raids. While Göring did protect certain collections, he simultaneously plundered others, having trainloads of art shipped back to Germany for public museums or his private collection. The collection he amassed was staggering in scope and value. Andreas Hofer and his assistant Gisela Limburger maintained meticulous records, creating detailed ledgers with photographs of every piece, documentation of when and where each work was bought or sold, and specifications of restorations performed. All proceeds from art sales were directed toward construction of the planned Hermann Göring Museum. On July 31, 1941, Göring issued an order to Reinhard Heydrich, Himmler's right-hand man in the SS, to make necessary preparations for a total solution of the Jewish question. This command, delivered in bureaucratic language that disguised its genocidal intent, set in motion the planning that would culminate in the Wannsee Conference of January 1942, where Heydrich detailed procedures for the systematic extermination of European Jewry. Although Göring had little involvement in the day-to-day operations of the Holocaust, that fell primarily to Himmler. Heydrich, Adolf Eichmann, and the camp commandants, he bore responsibility as the official who gave the initial authorization for the SS to begin the extermination program. This order, more than any other single action, would ensure Göring's death sentence at Nuremberg and cement his reputation as one of the Holocaust's primary instigators. By the end of 1941 and into 1942, the Russian campaign's failure was becoming undeniable. The troops, supplies, logistics, and technology needed to defeat the Soviet Union exceeded Germany's capacity to provide them. Göring remained in charge of labor allocation, currency management, and rationing. But this changed on March 21, 1942, when he announced that Fritz Sauckel would assume responsibility for labor assignment. While Göring was theoretically still to be consulted on labor matters, he had effectively removed himself from direct involvement in the cruelty and extermination programs being implemented in Eastern Europe. Sauckel filled factories with slave labor drawn from concentration camps and implemented programs to literally work prisoners to death. Hitler and Göring's relationship deteriorated as the war progressed. The Allies achieved increasing air superiority as German aircraft production couldn't keep pace with losses. Hitler ordered impossible missions, demanding all-out assaults on England by a Luftwaffe that no longer possessed the resources for such operations. Göring knew these orders were suicidal and impossible to execute, yet Hitler refused to accept either Göring's realistic assessments or his offers to resign. Göring was stuck. Hitler would neither accept his advice nor release him from his responsibilities. As the Third Reich disintegrated, Göring increasingly withdrew from decision-making. He wasn't even present during the D-Day invasion on June 6, 1944, when Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy and opened a Western front that would prove decisive. The last vestige of Göring's influence was demonstrated after the failed Operation Valkyrie, the July 20, 1944 assassination attempt against Hitler. Göring's nephew had been arrested on suspicion of involvement in the conspiracy, but there was no evidence proving his participation. Göring used his remaining political capital to secure his nephew's release, demonstrating that family loyalty still meant something to him, even as millions died in the war he had helped unleash. As the Red Army advanced in 1945, closing in on Hall, Göring ordered the artwork removed and had a demolition team rig the entire estate to explode. Germany was collapsing and Göring was preparing for the end. As defeat loomed, he and Emmy escaped into Bavaria, where they hoped to find some measure of safety. In the chaos of Germany's final collapse, U.S. First Lieutenant Jerome N. Shapiro found Göring stuck in a traffic jam. When Shapiro brought him into American custody, Göring seemed almost relieved, as though being captured by the Americans represented escape from a nightmare rather than the beginning of punishment. Göring was transported to the 7th Army Interrogation Center in Augsburg. In reports filed by American interrogators, they noted, "Göring is by no means the comical figure he has been depicted so many times in newspaper reports. He is neither stupid nor a fool, but generally cool and calculating. He is certainly not a man to be underrated." Although Göring attempted to minimize the regime's crimes, he provided vivid and authentic accounts of life in Nazi Germany that had eluded the Allies throughout the war. He told them about art that hadn't fallen into Russian hands, helping the Allies recover significant cultural treasures. Eventually, Göring was moved to a small suite in the Palace Hotel at Mondorf, Luxembourg, a facility serving as temporary detention for high-ranking Nazis. Here, Göring encountered other captured leaders: Joachim von Ribbentrop, foreign minister, Admiral Karl Dönitz, Albert Speer, and others. Ironically, Dr. Robert M. Kempner, who would prosecute the Nuremberg trials, had been the youngest prosecuting counsel in the Prussian police department when Göring fired him in 1933 for being Jewish. Leading up to the trial, Göring underwent detoxification from morphine and lost significant weight. Unannounced room inspections ensured no contraband entered his cell. Before the trial began, Dr. Kempner indicted Göring on all 4 counts: crimes against peace, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and conspiracy to commit all 3. In response to the upcoming trial, Göring declared, "It's just a cut-and-dried political affair, and I'm prepared for the consequences. I have no doubt that the press will play a bigger part in the decision than the judges, and I'm sure that the Russian and French judges at least already have their instructions. I can answer for anything I have done, and I can't answer for anything I haven't done. But the victors are the judges." The Nuremberg trials would reveal the full extent of Nazi atrocities to the world. Colonel Andrus, who commanded the detention facility, successfully minimized Göring's influence over other defendants by separating lunch groups into categories, preventing Göring from dominating discussions and maintaining Nazi solidarity among the accused. The International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg commenced on November 19, 1945, bringing together 24 of the most prominent surviving members of Hitler's regime to face justice for their crimes. The trial would run until October 1, 1946, nearly 11 months of testimony, evidence presentation, and legal argument that would establish precedents for international law and war crimes prosecution that endure to this day. Hermann Göring occupied a unique position among the defendants. Many had been minor functionaries or specialists in particular areas, men like Albert Speer, the architect and armaments minister, or Joachim von Ribbentrop, the foreign minister who had negotiated treaties. But Göring had been designated Hitler's successor, had commanded the Luftwaffe, had created the Gestapo, and had authorized the final solution. He was, in effect, the highest-ranking Nazi to stand trial, since Hitler, Goebbels, and Himmler had all committed suicide as the Reich collapsed. The judges found Göring guilty on all 4 counts levied against him. The verdict was never in doubt, the evidence was overwhelming. Yet what made Göring's trial particularly significant was not the outcome, but the performance he delivered throughout the proceedings. Unlike many defendants who appeared broken, confused, or eager to distance themselves from the regime's crimes, Göring remained defiant. He used the trial as a platform to defend National Socialism, to justify German aggression, and to present himself as a loyal soldier who had served his nation honorably. This stance earned him both condemnation and a perverse kind of respect from observers who recognized that Göring, at least, refused to engage in the self-serving evasions that characterized many other defendants' testimonies. American prosecutors presented mountains of documentation. They showed intercepted conversations revealing Göring's knowledge of concentration camps, his authorization of the final solution, his personal involvement in looting art from occupied territories, and his central role in planning aggressive war. They demonstrated his culpability in the Luftwaffe's bombing of civilian populations, his participation in ordering the execution of Allied airmen who had been captured, and his knowledge of slave labor conditions in factories producing war materials. Göring's defense attorney attempted various strategies. He argued that Göring had been following orders from Hitler and thus bore diminished responsibility. He claimed that Göring had attempted to moderate the regime's worst excesses, a claim undermined by documentary evidence of Göring's enthusiastic participation in nearly every criminal policy the regime had implemented. Perhaps most tellingly, when confronted with evidence of the Holocaust's scope and brutality, Göring did not deny knowledge or express remorse. Instead, he argued that Germany had been fighting for its survival against enemies who sought its destruction, and that in such circumstances, extreme measures became necessary. This argument that Germany's perceived existential crisis justified genocide found no sympathy with the tribunal. On October 1, 1946, the verdicts were delivered. Of the 8 judges on the tribunal, 3 voted to sentence Göring to death, while the remaining 5 initially preferred life imprisonment. After deliberation, a compromise was reached. Göring would be sentenced to death by hanging, but given his rank and military service, there was some consideration of allowing him a military execution by firing squad instead. Göring formally requested execution by firing squad, what he termed a soldier's death, befitting his service and rank. The request was denied. The tribunal determined that hanging was the appropriate punishment for the crimes Göring had committed, regardless of his military decorations or former positions of authority. For Göring, this denial represented a profound humiliation. Throughout his life, he had cultivated an image as an aristocratic warrior, the decorated fighter ace who commanded respect and honor. To be hanged like a common criminal, rather than executed with military honors, struck at the core of his self-conception. Following the sentencing, security at the prison was dramatically tightened to prevent any of the condemned men from cheating the hangman's noose through suicide. The executions were scheduled for 2 a.m. on October 16, 1946. In the final days before his scheduled execution, various individuals visited Göring in his cell for final conversations. Prison chaplain Captain Henry Göring visited Göring on the evening before the execution. He later reported that Göring appeared profoundly depressed. The defiant bravado he had maintained throughout the trial had finally cracked under the weight of his approaching death. That night, Lieutenant John West conducted the routine evening inspection of Göring's cell. West reported finding no contraband and noted that Göring seemed unusually cheerful, talking at length during the search, a marked change from the depression Göring had observed just hours earlier. At 9:30 p.m., Dr. Ludwig Flücker and Lieutenant Arthur McClendon visited to administer Göring's nightly medication. They remained in his cell for 3 minutes before departing. At 10:30 p.m., Private First Class Gordon Bingham began guard duty outside Göring's cell. At 10:44 p.m., Private Harold Johnson relieved Bingham and took up the watch. Around 10:50 p.m., Johnson noticed that Göring's body had become strangely stiff and motionless. When senior guard officers reached Göring's cell minutes later, Hermann Göring was dead from cyanide poisoning. He had cheated the hangman after all. Göring left behind 2 farewell letters. The first was a defiant rebuttal of the trial's findings, restating his belief that he had served Germany honorably and that the victorious Allies had no moral authority to judge him. The second was an affectionate letter to Emmy, expressing love for her and their daughter, Edda. Most intriguingly, Göring left a letter addressed to Colonel Andrus, the prison commandant, in which he claimed to have possessed a cyanide capsule throughout his entire imprisonment. He boasted about having hidden it so skillfully that despite all the searches and inspections, it had never been discovered. The letter was written in a tone of triumph, a final demonstration of his cleverness in outwitting his captors. The question of how Göring obtained and concealed the cyanide has never been definitively answered. Several theories have been proposed. Some believe he had hidden multiple capsules on his person when captured, and that interrogators simply failed to find them all. Others suggest that sympathetic guards or visitors may have smuggled the poison to him. Still others speculate that the capsule had been concealed in some personal item that was allowed to remain with him. Whatever the truth, Göring's suicide robbed the Allies of the opportunity to execute him publicly. Whether this represented a final victory for Göring or merely delayed by hours, the inevitable remains a matter of perspective. Joachim von Ribbentrop became the first defendant to be executed, hanged at approximately 1 a.m. on October 16th, an hour before Göring's scheduled execution. The remaining death sentences were carried out systematically, each execution taking approximately 15 minutes. The entire process required just over an hour. The bodies of the executed war criminals were placed into caskets and transported to a crematorium under heavy guard. Officials feared civil disturbances or attempts by Nazi sympathizers to create martyrs' shrines, so security remained intense throughout. Once the bodies had been verified and cremated, the ashes were driven into the countryside and dumped into a drainage ditch, a deliberately ignominious disposal designed to prevent any site from becoming a pilgrimage. Destination for Nazi sympathizers, Hermann Göring's ashes were scattered, alongside those of the other executed Nazi leaders, denied even the dignity of a marked grave or memorial. Hermann Göring remains one of the more complex and fascinating figures within Hitler's inner circle. His documented record as a fighter ace in World War I was genuine. He had been a brave and skilled pilot who earned the highest military decorations Germany could bestow. His subsequent drug addiction, though it began as legitimate medical treatment for combat wounds, eventually contributed to his physical and psychological deterioration. Göring's love of the arts and his relatively sophisticated cultural tastes distinguished him from cruder Nazi leaders. He could discuss Renaissance painting with genuine knowledge and appreciation. He enjoyed opera, classical music, and fine architecture. In different circumstances, one might imagine him as a museum curator or art historian rather than a war criminal. Yet these cultivated interests coexisted with breathtaking brutality and corruption. Göring was greedy and utterly ruthless, scheming repeatedly against rivals within the regime. He used his power to amass personal wealth through looting on an almost incomprehensible scale. His art collection alone, acquired largely through theft from Jewish families and occupied territories, was worth hundreds of millions. Furthermore, his position as one of the Holocaust's instigators cannot be minimized or explained away by claims of cultural sophistication. Göring signed the order authorizing Heydrich to implement the final solution. He knew about the concentration camps and the mass murder occurring within them. When Jewish art dealers needed exit visas to escape Germany, Göring provided them, not out of humanitarian concern, but to facilitate continued art transactions. His protection extended only to those who could serve his collecting obsession. The vast majority of European Jews received no such consideration. Göring's testimony at Nuremberg revealed a man who felt no genuine remorse for his actions. He defended the regime's aggression as necessary for German survival. He characterized the Holocaust as an unfortunate consequence of war rather than a systematic genocide. He maintained that he had served Germany honorably and that only Germany's military defeat, not any moral failing, had brought him to trial. This unrepentant stance, combined with his intelligence, charisma, and willingness to defend Nazi ideology even in the dock, made Göring particularly dangerous as a symbol. Had he lived, his continued defiance might have inspired neo-Nazi movements in the post-war period. His suicide, while denying the Allies their public execution, at least prevented him from becoming a living martyr for those who wished to resurrect fascism. Throughout his life, Göring demonstrated a remarkable capacity for self-deception and rationalization. He convinced himself that his corruption was merely accepting the perquisites of power that any leader would claim. He rationalized his drug addiction as a medical necessity rather than a personal failing. He portrayed his role in the Holocaust as following orders and serving Germany rather than participating in genocide. This capacity for self-deception extended to his strategic judgment. As head of the Luftwaffe, Göring consistently overestimated German capabilities and underestimated Allied resources. His assurances to Hitler that the Luftwaffe could supply the encircled German Sixth Army at Stalingrad by air alone proved catastrophically wrong, contributing to one of Germany's most devastating defeats. His promises that German air defenses would protect the homeland from Allied bombing proved equally hollow as British and American bombers systematically destroyed German cities. Yet Göring also possessed genuine talents. His organizational abilities in the Luftwaffe's early years were considerable. He built a modern air force essentially from nothing in just a few years. His political instincts were often sharp. He understood how to accumulate and maintain power within the Byzantine politics of Hitler's regime. His ability to present a sophisticated, cosmopolitan face for the Nazi regime made him valuable in dealings with foreign diplomats and industrialists, who might have been repelled by Hitler's crude manner or Goebbels's fanaticism. The tragedy of Hermann Göring, if one can speak of tragedy in connection with such a figure, is that he possessed talents and qualities that could have been used constructively, but instead were placed entirely in service of evil. His bravery as a young fighter pilot, his organizational skills, his intelligence, his charisma, all of these might have served Germany honorably in different circumstances. Instead, he chose to ally himself with Hitler's criminal regime, to participate enthusiastically in its worst crimes, and to use his abilities to enable genocide and aggressive war. Observers at Nuremberg were struck by the stark difference between Göring and some of the other defendants. Men like Hans Frank, the former Governor-General of Poland, expressed remorse and acknowledged their guilt. Albert Speer attempted to position himself as a reluctant participant who had been seduced by Hitler's charisma. Even Ribbentrop, the foreign minister, claimed he had simply been following diplomatic protocols and hadn't understood the regime's true nature. Göring engaged in no such evasions. He defended Hitler, defended National Socialism, and defended Germany's right to wage aggressive war and eliminate its perceived enemies. When confronted with evidence of atrocities, he didn't deny knowledge or participation. He argued that such measures had been militarily necessary and that Germany's existential struggle justified extraordinary actions. This defiance has been interpreted various ways. Some see it as courage, a refusal to abandon his convictions even when facing death. Others view it as the ultimate evidence of his moral bankruptcy, an inability or unwillingness to recognize the magnitude of the crimes he had enabled. Still others suggest it reflected Göring's narcissism. Admitting guilt would have required acknowledging that his life had been dedicated to monstrous evil, a psychological blow his ego could not withstand. Perhaps all three interpretations contain truth. Göring was courageous in a certain sense. He faced death without begging for mercy or attempting to shift blame. He was morally bankrupt. His crimes were inexcusable regardless of his rationalizations. And he was certainly a narcissist whose inflated self-image required constant defense and justification. Hermann Göring's life trajectory from decorated war hero to drug-addicted war criminal, illustrates the corrupting nature of totalitarian movements and unchecked power. The young fighter ace who risked his life repeatedly for Germany became the middle-aged politician who signed orders condemning millions to death. The man who loved Renaissance art and classical music used his position to loot the cultural patrimony of occupied Europe on a scale unprecedented in modern history. In the end, perhaps the most damning assessment of Göring came from his fellow defendants. Albert Speer, in his memoirs, described Göring as someone who had once possessed genuine abilities but had been utterly corrupted by power and luxury. Rudolf Hess, Hitler's former deputy, called him a man without principles who would sacrifice anything and anyone for personal advantage. Even those who had worked alongside Göring for years ultimately recognized the hollowness at his core. The question posed at the beginning remains: was Hermann Göring merely a talented individual who made catastrophically bad choices? Or was there something fundamentally corrupt in his character from the start? The evidence suggests a combination. The young Göring showed both positive qualities: bravery, loyalty, intelligence, and troubling ones, recklessness, contempt for authority, willingness to use violence to achieve goals. These traits might have led him in various directions. In a stable democratic Germany, he might have had an honorable military career or become a successful businessman. But in the chaos of Weimar Germany, with its economic crises and political extremism, these same traits led him into Hitler's orbit. Once there, his ambition, his greed, and his moral flexibility made him an enthusiastic participant in the regime's crimes, rather than a reluctant accomplice. Hermann Göring died as he had lived, on his own terms when possible, defiant of authority, convinced of his own righteousness despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. His death by cyanide capsule, just hours before his scheduled execution, was perhaps fitting, a final act of defiance that changed nothing but his manner of death, leaving his crimes and guilt undiminished, but denying his captors the satisfaction of executing him on their schedule. History remembers him as the jovial, art-loving, drug-addicted second-in-command of the Third Reich, a man of undeniable talents and equally undeniable crimes, whose complexity makes him no less culpable for the horrors he helped perpetrate. He remains a cautionary tale about how individual gifts and abilities, when placed in service of evil ideologies and unrestrained by moral principles, can contribute to catastrophic human suffering. The last word on Hermann Göring perhaps belongs to Justice Robert H. Jackson, the chief American prosecutor at Nuremberg, who said in his closing statement, Göring was often the moving force, second only to Hitler. He was the planner and designer of the scheme to exterminate the Jews. He directed the persecution of Jews, particularly after the November 1938 riots, and coordinated the various phases of the Nazi program. As Hitler's plenipotentiary for the 4-year plan, he was also instrumental in the economic exploitation and spoliation of occupied territories. The testimony and the documents establish with certainty Göring's responsibility for slave labor, for concentration camps, for terrorism in occupied countries, and for the mass murder of prisoners of war. This judgment stands. Whatever else Hermann Göring may have been, war hero, art collector, devoted husband and father, he was ultimately a war criminal whose actions contributed to the deaths of millions and the devastation of an entire continent. His suicide prevented his execution, but could not alter his guilt or prevent history's harsh judgment.